There are men who ride toward their mistakes the same way they ride toward everything else, straight-backed, jaw set, with the particular look of someone who has decided they are doing a favor rather than seeking one. I have known a few such men in my time, and I want to tell you about one of them tonight. Because his story, and more importantly, her story, is one that has stayed with me longer than most. His name was Lord Aldous Kane, the Earl of Thornwick, and he was riding northeast through a cold October morning toward a place he had not visited in 3 years. He told himself he was making a routine inspection of the estate holdings. He told himself this with some conviction, because he was practiced at it. But underneath that story he'd built for himself, underneath the posture and the good boots and the signet ring, catching what little sun the clouds permitted, there was a simpler truth. He had heard something. A rumor. Several rumors in him in a way he was not prepared to examine directly, so he rode. Now, before I tell you what he found when he arrived, I think you deserve to know the full shape of what he had done. You deserve to understand exactly the kind of man Lord Kane was at the beginning of this story, because if I skip that part, the ending won't hit you the way it should. Lord Aldous Kane had inherited the Thornwick earldom at the age of 26, which is far too young an age to receive that much land, that many obligations, and that particular species of arrogance that comes with an old title. His father had been a charming spendthrift, and the estate, 3 properties across 2 counties, tenants in arrears, roofs in want of repair, ledgers that told a story no one wished to read aloud, was not what it appeared from the outside. From the outside it appeared to be Thornwick. That was often enough. What the earldom needed was money. What money required in those days was either extraordinary luck or a very particular kind of marriage. Leonora Voss was not what Lord Kane would have chosen had he been in a position to choose freely. Her grandfather had made a considerable fortune in textile mills in the north. Her father, Gerald Voss, had tripled that fortune through uncommonly shrewd investments in wool trade and shipping. But he had also, in the process, remained precisely what he was, a practical man from practical stock, who kept his own accounts, knew the price of things, and had no patience whatsoever for ornament. He had raised his daughter the same way. She knew the price of things too. She could read a ledger as easily as a novel, probably faster, and she had opinions about soil drainage that would have startled most drawing rooms into silence. She was 24 when she married Lord Kane. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped conversation, but she had the kind of face that rewarded a second look. Steady grey eyes, dark hair she wore, simply because she found elaborate arrangements a waste of time, a quality of attention about her that made people feel, when she was listening to them, that they were being truly heard. Her father's money was substantial. Her settlement, arranged by her father's lawyers, who were not the sort of men who forgot to read the fine print, protected her personal inheritance, the fund her grandfather had placed in trust for her alone, from her husband's creditors and her husband's hands alike. Gerald Voss had not climbed to where he was by being careless with the things he loved. Lord Kane had understood this before the wedding. He had not fully reckoned with what it meant. The match was presented, in society, as a sensible arrangement, the Earl's title, the merchant's fortune, each lending the other a respectability it lacked. Lord Kane told himself this was simply how things were done. He was not cruel. He was careful to note this to himself. He was not cruel. He did not shout. He did not demean her in public. What he did was more quiet than that, and in some ways more corrosive. He made her feel consistently and with tremendous efficiency that she did not belong. The lifted eyebrow when she mentioned something she had read about crop rotation, the particular smile, not a warm smile, the other kind, when she asked a question at dinner that was slightly too confident for a Countess of Thornwick to be asking, for a Count Thwaffac to be asking. The way he referred to her family, when he referred to them at all, with a courtesy so precise it contained within it the clear suggestion that he was working very hard to overlook their origins. Leonora, for her part, said little. She watched. She learned. She kept her own counsel in the way that people do when they have understood, fairly early, that counsel offered will not be welcome. Then, in the second year of their marriage, something happened that Lord Kane would later recognize as the turning point, though he would be ashamed to admit what it revealed about him. There was a woman, a Lady Weston, widow, a fixture of the county social circuit, handsome in a cool, deliberate way, who made no secret of her interest in the Earl. She was not the villain of this story, precisely. She was simply a fact that Lord Kane allowed to exist too close to his household for too long without address. And Leonora, who noticed things, noticed this. She said nothing. Not then. What changed was smaller than a scandal and larger than a conversation. It was a letter Leonora had written to her father. A long letter, detailed, the kind one writes when one is trying to make sense of a situation by putting it into words for someone who will understand, which was opened, read, and returned to her writing desk with the flap resealed just poorly enough that she knew. She never said so. She simply understood that there were no private rooms in this marriage. 6 weeks later, Lord Kane told her, in the same tone one uses to communicate a household schedule, that she would be spending the season at Kane's Hollow. The Hollow was the third and smallest of the Thornwick holdings, 60 acres in a valley in Northumberland that had once been productive farmland, and was now, due to a decade of mismanagement and neglect, neither productive nor much else. There was a house. The house had a roof that mostly held. There was a village nearby, small and struggling, its farmers working soil that had been tired for 20 years. He called it a rest. He said the London air had been hard on her. He said this with the same precision he used for everything. Leonora packed her own trunk. She brought her books, her correspondence, and a set of her grandfather's journals that she had always meant to read more carefully. He had been a practical man, too, and his journals were full of observations about the management of land and people that she had found, when she was younger, unexpectedly interesting. She brought her lady's maid, Dorothea, a plain-spoken woman of 40 who had been with her since before the marriage and who referred to the Earl of Thornwick, in private, as that particular gentleman, in a tone that required no further elaboration. They departed on a grey Tuesday. Lord Kane did not see them off. He had an engagement now. Here is where I want to pause, my friends, because this is the part of the story where lesser tellings go wrong. They spend too much time in Leonora's grief, the cold house, the dripping eaves, the loneliness. And she did grieve, don't mistake me. The first week in that valley was as bleak as anything she had known. The house smelled of damp and disuse. The single remaining groundskeeper was an elderly man named Mr. Pell, who did not seem entirely sure what year it was. The village she could see from her bedroom window was very quiet and very worn. But Leonora Voss, I will use her maiden name now because it fits her better in this passage. Leonora Voss had not been raised by Gerald Voss to sit with her hands folded waiting for someone to arrive and fix things. On the fourth day, she put on her riding boots and went out. She walked the 60 acres, all of them. She took notes in a small leather journal. The soil in the lower fields was clay-heavy but not hopeless. Her grandfather had written about similar land in a chapter she had read twice on the journey north. The drainage was poor, which explained the standing water in the east field, which explained why nothing had grown there in years. The south-facing slope, she stopped there a long time, shielding her eyes, doing calculations she could not quite have explained, had excellent exposure. No one had planted it as anything but rough pasture. It was, she noted, being wasted. She went to the village. Her reception was cautious, the way the reception is in small places where strangers have come before and not stayed. She met the innkeeper's wife, a Mrs. Dunbar, who told her in 5 sentences more about the valley's situation than anyone in London had managed in 3 years. The mill had been idle for 18 months. 3 farming families had left. The ones who remained were managing, but only just, and managing was not the same as living. Leonora listened. She asked questions. She came back the next day and asked more. She wrote to her father. What followed over the next several months is the part of the story I find most worth telling, because it happened quietly, without announcement, without anyone particularly watching, which is often how the most significant things happen. Gerald Voss replied to his daughter's letter within a week. He replied with information, with contacts, with the name of an agricultural consultant in Edinburgh who had done remarkable work with depleted land. He also, and this is the part that Lord Kane would never know how to feel about, arranged for the proper legal release of Leonora's personal trust fund. Not for Thornwick, for her, for what she chose to build. She chose to build a great deal. If you are still with me, my dear friends, and I do hope you are, because this next part is where the story earns itself, I want you to picture the valley called Kane's Hollow 18 months after Leonora arrived. The mill was running. She had hired a mill manager, a young man named Mr. Rafferty, recently returned from apprenticeship in Manchester, who had been unable to find work anywhere else, and who proved, once given the chance, to be exactly as capable as he appeared. The east fields had been drained, properly this time, with a system of channels that Mr. Pell had helped design from memory. He knew more than she had initially credited, and then replanted with a rotation of crops suited to the soil. The south-facing slope was an orchard now, young trees still, but standing in tidy rows, properly staked, attended to each morning by a boy from the village named Tom, who was 12 years old and had not known what to do with himself until Leonora suggested the orchard as a project and handed him a book about fruit trees. The 3 families who had left came back. Then 2 more families arrived from a neighboring valley where the situation was worse. Leonora had also established a small lending library in the village. It occupied 2 shelves in the back room of Mrs. Dunbar's inn. It held mostly practical volumes: farming, animal husbandry, household medicine, basic accounting. But there were 3 novels too. Because Leonora understood that people needed more than information, she had learned to ride properly here. Not the careful managed trot that was acceptable at Thornwick, but actually ride the way her husband's groomsman, Mr. Healy, had finally agreed to teach her when she asked him directly enough. She had calluses on her hands. Her riding habit had been repaired twice, and she did not mind. What she had not done, in all this time, was write to Lord Kane. She sent the required quarterly letters about the property, brief and factual. She reported improvements. She did not report her own feelings. She had found, somewhere in the first winter, that she no longer needed to explain herself to anyone who hadn't asked. Dorothea, watching all of this, said only, "You've found your footing, my lady." Leonora had said, "I think I found it by losing the other one." Now, the rumours Lord Aldous Kane had been hearing, and this is where we return to the man on horseback, riding northeast through the October cold, were specific enough to be unsettling. The valley was recovering, they said. Someone at his club had asked, with a certain careful politeness that was worse than open curiosity, whether he'd been down to Northumberland lately, whether the estates there were producing again, whether his countess had a particular talent for land management that had not been widely appreciated. He had smiled and changed the subject. But the questions followed him home, and the unmistakable air of a woman. He had also heard through a roundabout chain of acquaintance that a textiler from York had passed through the valley on his way north and had spent an afternoon with the Countess of Thornwick and her mill manager, discussing the output capacity of the restored mill. The investor had mentioned to someone who had mentioned it to someone else that the Countess was a remarkably clear-headed woman who knew her own operation better than most men knew theirs. Lord Kane found he did not know quite what to do with that information, so he rode. He crested the ridge above Kane's Hollow on an afternoon when the light was doing what northern October light does at its best, slanting gold across the hills, catching the frost on the high grass, making everything look as though it had just been washed. And he stopped. Below him was not what he expected. He had expected. Well, he had not, if he was honest, thought very carefully about what he expected. He had told himself he was making an inspection, which allowed him not to think too precisely about what he expected to find. But somewhere underneath that, he had expected something diminished, something that confirmed the picture he carried of this place and of her. A quiet, difficult woman in a difficult, quiet place. What was below him was not that. The mill wheel was turning. He could hear it from the ridge. The fields to the east were clearly tended, the harvest recently taken in. The stubble rose straight and even. There were cattle in the pasture by the creek. He did not know if there had been cattle there before. He did not think so. On the south-facing slope, he could make out rows of young trees. An orchard. Someone had planted an orchard on that slope, and on the road below him, clearly visible, was a woman on horseback, riding without hesitation toward the village, her posture easy and certain, in a way that did not match the image he'd carried of her in his head. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he rode down. She saw him before he reached the bottom of the hill. He watched her recognize him, the slight adjustment of her bearing, the thing that was not quite a flinch but was the opposite of welcome. And then she waited. She did not ride to meet him. She waited where she was. Still, as a woman had had 3 years to decide what she will say when this moment comes, and has decided not to say it first, he dismounted. She did not. "Lady Kane," he said. Lord Kane," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered, except that it wasn't. Something had settled in it that had not been there before. He looked at the mill. He looked at the orchard. He looked at a child, the boy Tom, though he didn't know that, who was crossing the road with a basketed, and who nodded to Leonora with the easy familiarity of someone who did this every day. "I had heard," he began, and then stopped, because what he had heard did not organize itself conveniently into the kind of sentence that served him. "Yes," she said. "It seems word travels." He tried again. "The valley, what you have done here." "What I have done here," she said, "is what needed doing. There were people here, my lord, who needed someone to act. I acted." There was a pause. The mill wheel turned. Somewhere in the village a dog barked and was answered by another. "I should have come sooner," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He had prepared, during the long ride, something like a speech. He had refined it over several hours in the saddle. It had contained, if he recalled correctly, references to the difficulties of the estate, the pressures of his position, the ways in which he had perhaps, his word perhaps, not fully appreciated what she brought to their marriage. He had thought it rather good. He did not say any of it. Looking at her on that horse, on that road she had apparently rebuilt from ruts and mud into something smooth and maintained, looking at the orchard on the hill behind her, he found that the speech sounded, in his own head, like exactly what it was. A man who had not been sorry until he saw what he had underestimated. "I was wrong," he said. "Just that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Which part specifically?" she said. "Are you referring to?" It was not an easy question. He understood receiving it, that it was not meant to be. He understood that she was not angry. Anger would have been simpler, more manageable, more familiar. She was something else. She was asking him a real question, and she intended to hear a real answer. He took a breath. "All of it," he said. "I married you because I needed your family's money, and I thought that was a fair exchange, the name for the fortune, without ever once asking whether it was fair to you. I treated you as though you were a deficit to be managed. I sent you here." He stopped, looked at the mill, at the orchard. "I sent you here as a punishment, and you turned it into this, and the shame of that is mine to carry." The wind came down off the ridge and moved through the orchard rows. "It is," she said quietly. "Yes, I have no right to ask to come back," he said. "I understand that." "You don't," she agreed. "You haven't earned it." He nodded. "Then I would ask," he said, "to earn it, if you will allow me the chance." A very long pause. "Lord Kane," she said at last, "there is a fence in the north pasture that has been in need of repair for 6 weeks. Mr. Pell's back will not permit him to do it. Mr. Rafferty is occupied with the mill accounts. I have been waiting for someone with both the time and the obligation to see to it." She looked at him steadily. "There are tools in the barn," she said. "The barn is the second building on the left. You will find the fence before you reach the creek." And she rode past him, into the village at the same easy, unhurried pace with which she had been riding before he arrived. He stood there in the road for a moment. Then he handed his horse to Mr. Healy, who had come around the corner of the stable at some point and was watching, and is keeping them expression of a man who has opinions and is keeping them to himself. He found the barn. He found the tools. He fixed the fence. He was not good at it, not at first. His hands blistered in the first hour. Mistakes that had to be undone and done again. But he stayed until it was done, until the light was going and his arms ached, and then he went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room, the kitchen, and ate the meal that Dorothea put in front of him without ceremony or comment. He stayed the week. He did not stay as a lord of the manor. He asked Mr. Rafferty what work was needed, and he did it. He split wood. He helped dig a drainage channel in the lower field that 2 of the village men were extending. He ate at the kitchen table every night. On the 3rd evening, Leonora sat across the table from him. They talked, haltingly at first. Then, with a little more ease, about the mill, the orchard, the plans she had for the spring planting. She talked about her grandfather's journals and what she had learned from them. He listened. He did not lift an eyebrow. He asked a question, a genuine question, not a managed one, about the orchard variety she had chosen for the slope, and she answered it with the same level care she gave every practical question. And it was quietly the best conversation they had ever had. On the 5th night, she said, "You are going to want to go back to London eventually." "Yes," he said. "And when you do," she said, "this valley will continue whether you are in it or not. The mill will run. Mr. Rafferty will manage the accounts. The orchard will grow. I have built something here that does not require you." "I know," he said. "I want to be certain," she said, "that you understand what you would be coming back to. Not a wife who is grateful for your return. Not a household that reorganizes itself around your presence. A partnership. If you cannot offer that, the fence in the north pasture was a fine start, and I will write you a good reference for manual labor." He was quiet. Then, to his own surprise, he laughed. A real one, the first in quite some time. "I can offer that," he said. "I intend to. I cannot promise I will be perfect at it." "Mr. Rafferty is not perfect at the mill accounts either," she said. "He makes errors and corrects them. I find that more useful than perfection. This, my dear friends, is the thing I want you to take with you when you leave this fireside tonight. Not the grand gesture, not the man on horseback cresting the dramatic hill. Those are the parts that catch the eye. The part that matters is the fence. It matters because she did not ask him to grovel. She did not ask him to make speeches or write letters or present her with an accounting of his remorse. She handed him a problem and she walked away, and she waited to see whether he would solve it. That is a different kind of test than the ones we usually talk about, and it is, I would argue, a harder one, because it is not asking whether a man can feel sorry. Feeling sorry is easy, in the right light, with the right audience. It is asking whether he can be useful. He was, imperfectly, with blisters and beginner's errors, but genuinely, and that was how it began. Lord Kane returned to London. He settled the affairs that required settling. He came back to Kane's Hollow in the spring, and the spring after that, and in the 3rd year he was there more often than not. He learned, slowly and with some difficulty, how to be a man who noticed things rather than a man who expected things to be noticed on his behalf. He was not transformed overnight. That is not how people work. But he worked at it, which is the only honest version of change there is. Leonora expanded the orchard to the full south slope. She hired a school teacher for the village and arranged for the lending library to have proper shelves built by a local carpenter. She insisted it be a local carpenter. She wrote to her father regularly. She continued to read her grandfather's journals. She did not stop being herself in order to accommodate him. She had tried that once, and it had cost her 2 years and a marriage worth nothing. She found, to her own mild surprise, that when she stopped trying to fit herself to someone else's idea of what a countess should be, there was rather more of her than she had previously taken inventory of. Her father visited in the 3rd autumn. He walked the orchard with her, listened to the mill, sat in the kitchen rather than the dining room, and told her quietly. Not the sort of thing he said often, that he thought she had done something remarkable. She told him she had simply done what needed doing. He said those two things were the same thing most of the time. He was right, and as for Lord Aldous Kane, Earl of Thornwick, the man who had ridden north that October morning, with his careful posture and his careful excuses, he did eventually earn his way back. Not to the marriage he had assumed was his by right of the ring and the name and the transaction he had believed it to be. That marriage was gone, and good riddance to it. He earned his way back to something better. A woman who had decided he was worth the trouble, not because she needed him, but because she had chosen him freely, with full knowledge of exactly what she was getting, and had chosen to see whether the man on the fence, blistered and trying, was the truer version of him. She decided he was. That is not a small thing to be decided. Before I let you go tonight, my dear friends, I do want to say, if you have found your way to this fireside for the first time, if someone passed you this story and you sat down to listen and you are still here at the end of it, please do stay. We gather here often, and the stories we keep are always the ones like this, the ones where someone, sent to the ruin, builds the kingdom. If that is your kind of story too, you know where to find us. And if you know someone who needs to hear tonight that the difficult place they've been sent to is not their ending, share this with them. Sometimes the hollow is the making of you. Now go. The fire is burning low, and you have things to tend to. So does she.